Lieutenant Ethan Ward had returned from Afghanistan, carrying scars the world couldn't see. But nothing prepared him for what he found at Street. Helena Hospital, his father, a retired war hero, slipping toward death under mysterious circumstances. The moment Ethan walked into that sterile room, his canine partner, Rex, began to growl, teeth bared at the nurse adjusting his father's IV. Something was wrong. The records didn't match. The nurse's name didn't exist. Within days, Ethan would uncover a chilling conspiracy, a secret network murdering veterans to steal their assets, hidden behind a mask of charity and care. What unfolds next is a story of loyalty, courage, and a miracle that only faith and a dog's love could deliver. Before we begin, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments, and may God bless you for standing with truth and hope. Snow whispered over Helena Ridge, a quiet mountain town wrapped in white silence. The streets were empty, the lamps muted under layers of drifting frost. Inside Street, Helena Hospital, everything smelled of antiseptic and loneliness. The corridors gleamed with sterile light, and each step echoed faintly against the linoleum floors, like the sound of distant memory. Lieutenant Ethan Ward walked slowly down the hallway, boots damp with melted snow. He had the build of a man carved by disciplined broad shoulders, an angular jaw shadowed by a few days' stubble, and eyes the color of a winter sky, calm, cold, but restless beneath the surface. The faint scar along his left cheekbone, a pale remnant of shrapnel from Kandahar, caught the fluorescent light. His movements were precise, controlled every gesture, deliberate, every breath, measured. He carried the stillness of a soldier who'd seen too much and spoken too little since returning from the war. Beside him, padded Rex, his 5-year-old German shepherd, large and powerful, with a sable-black coat that shimmered like steel under the hallway lights. Rex's eyes were sharp, intelligent, always scanning, always calculating. He had served beside Ethan through ambushes and desert patrols, had once dragged his handler out of a burning Humvee. Since then, a silent understanding had existed between them, one that didn't need words. Rex was not just a partner. He was a part of Ethan's conscience, the last living link to a brotherhood of ghosts. The hospital was unnervingly quiet. A single janitor mopped near the nurse's station, the scent of bleach heavy in the air. Somewhere, a machine beeped in rhythmic intervals, a reminder that time still moved for some, even as it stood still for others. Ethan reached room 214, the nameplate reading Arthur Ward. His father, the man who had raised him with the sternness of a Marine and the silence of a man who had seen too many funerals. Arthur Ward, 70 years old, had fought in Vietnam, a soldier who carried the war home in the stiffness of his shoulders and the temper of his heart. 2 months ago, a heart attack had left him in a coma. The doctors called him stable. Ethan called him absent. He opened the door quietly. The soft whir of medical machinery filled the air. His father lay beneath thin hospital blankets, his once broad chest now rising shallowly, his face gaunt and still. The sunlight filtering through the frosted window touched the old man's hair, now silver white, giving him the look of a soldier carved from ice. Ethan stood for a moment, unmoving, caught between duty and grief. "Hey, old man," he whispered finally. His voice was low, gravelly, the kind that carried years of unsaid words. "I'm home." No response, of course, only the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Ethan pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. The war hadn't left him. It lived under his skin, whispering in the quiet. He'd thought coming home would silence it, but here in this cold hospital, it felt closer than ever. Maybe because the one man who had taught him to survive was now fighting his final battle in silence. Rex settled on the floor near the foot of the bed, his head resting between his paws. His tail didn't move, his eyes fixed on the IV stand beside the bed. For a while, the room was still just the faint hum of machinery, the occasional drip from the IV bag. Then Rex's ears twitched. A low growl began deep in his throat, quiet but unmistakable. Ethan looked up instantly. "Easy," he murmured. But Rex didn't relax. His hackles rose, the fur along his spine stiffening. His gaze locked on the door. It opened with a soft click. A woman stepped in, her rubber soles squeaking faintly against the floor. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with fair skin that reflected the cold light of the room. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a bun, a few strands falling near her temples. A small silver chain with a cross hung at her throat, glinting as she moved. Her name tag read, Lena Moore. She smiled politely. "Good evening, Lieutenant Ward," she said, voice smooth and calm, like a practiced lullaby. "I'm just here to check your father's fluids." Ethan studied her face. The features were delicate, almost too symmetrical, as if carved by someone meticulous about perfection. But her eyes, pale gray, didn't match the warmth of her tone. They flicked from him to the bed, to the IV line, then back to Rex. Rex's growl deepened. "Oh," she said lightly, forcing a small laugh. "He doesn't like me much, does he?" Ethan didn't smile. "He's trained to detect explosives and chemicals," he replied evenly. "Sometimes he reacts to certain compounds." Her smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained composure. "Well, I'll make this quick then." She moved toward the IV stand. Ethan's eyes followed every motion. Her fingers were steady, too steady. The soft click of the syringe cap echoed louder than it should have in the small room. She adjusted the line, humming under her breath, something tuneless and faint. Rex stood up, body rigid. His tail went still. "Rex," Ethan said quietly, "stay." But his own pulse had begun to quicken. Years of field instinct told him when something didn't fit, when the rhythm of the world shifted slightly off-beat. He felt it now, that tension, that invisible current of danger that came right before a shot was fired. He rose from his chair slowly, not wanting to startle her. "I thought the IV was changed yesterday," he said casually. Lena turned, offering a small, rehearsed smile. "Oh, yes, but it needs a minor adjustment. Routine procedure." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze falling to the label on the bag, his brows furrowed. The handwriting was different, sharper, slanted, and then he saw it. Her name tag, Lena Moore, 2 E's, the smallest detail, but to a soldier trained to survive ambushes, small details were everything. He said nothing for a moment. Rex's breathing was shallow now, his focus locked on the woman's hands. "You're new here?" Ethan asked finally. She nodded. "Transferred from Street Louis, just last week." He looked at her again, the way he would study a potential threat on foreign soil, measuring tone, posture, micro-expressions. There was something too controlled about her calm, too smooth. He reached out casually and touched the IV tape near his father's wrist. Fresh. It hadn't been there yesterday. And in that moment, the faint hum of the hospital seemed to vanish. He could hear only his heartbeat, steady but heavy, and Rex's low growl rumbling like thunder about to break. Ethan's hand tightened on the chair. Her name was misspelled, the tape was new, and that familiar sensation, sharp, cold, unmistakable, rose inside him again. The feeling that had saved his life countless times on the battlefield. That something was terribly wrong. The soldier in him knew the truth before the man could admit it. A storm had followed him home, and it had already entered the room. The following morning rose gray and heavy, as if the storm from the night before had not truly passed, but merely sunk deeper into the bones of Street Helena Hospital. The snow outside the windows had turned to slush, melting into thin rivers that crawled down the glass, distorting the world beyond into a blurred watercolor of white and ash. Inside room 214, Ethan Ward sat in the same chair where he had fallen asleep, his back stiff, his mind restless. The faint mechanical rhythm of his father's heart monitor had become the only thing anchoring him to the present moment. His military instincts, honed by years of war, refused to let him rest. Something about the nurse, Lena Moore, her too-perfect calm, and that misplaced E in her name tag had sunk into his consciousness like a splinter. Rex stirred near the bed, his ears twitching even in half-sleep. The German shepherd's dark fur shimmered faintly under the sterile light, his paws twitching, as if chasing ghosts in a dream. When the door opened, Rex's eyes snapped open instantly, alert again, soldier to soldier. Dr. Henry Collins entered with a folder pressed to his chest, his face pale from exhaustion. He was a man in his mid-40s, with kind but perpetually worried hazel eyes behind rectangular glasses. His posture betrayed long nights and little rest. His lab coat hung loose on his lean frame. Henry had joined Street Helena 10 years ago, after losing his wife to a rare illness, a wound that had made him gentle to his patients but wary of the bureaucratic machine that ruled hospitals. He was the kind of man who carried guilt like others carried pens. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said softly. "I ran new labs on your father's blood last night." Ethan stood, his hands instinctively slipping into his jacket pockets. "And?" Henry exhaled through his nose, flipping open the folder. "His toxicity levels are elevated, not alarmingly, but enough to suggest something foreign in his bloodstream. It's not from his prescribed medication." Ethan's stomach tightened. "You're saying someone poisoned him?" Henry hesitated. "Not necessarily. It could be a reaction. But," he looked up, eyes narrowing, "the compound is consistent with a sedative derivative used in palliative care. But your father isn't on any end-of-life treatment plan." Ethan stared at him. The silence between them was heavy, like the air before a firefight. Could a nurse have made that mistake? Henry closed the folder. Not a trained one. Rex gave a low growl from beside the bed, as if seconding the thought. Henry looked at the dog, almost smiling. "He's got good instincts," Ethan's jaw flexed. "Better than most people I know." He turned toward the IV stand again. "That nurse, Lena Moore, how long has she been here?" Henry frowned. "Moore? About a week, I think." "Why?" Ethan told him about the misspelled tag, the changed line, Rex's reaction. As he spoke, the doctor's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. When he finished, Henry rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'll verify her credentials with admin," he said, quietly. Ethan nodded. "Do that, and keep the samples from last night locked away. I don't want them disappearing." "I'll handle it," Henry said. "But Ethan, be careful. Hospitals have more politics than war zones." The words lingered long after he left. By noon, Ethan was in the hospital cafe, a small, sterile space where the coffee tasted like cardboard and the walls hummed with the chatter of nurses on break. Rex lay at his feet, a silent shadow. The television above the counter murmured news about budget cuts for veterans programs. It was background noise until Ethan heard a voice beside him. "Lieutenant Ward?" He looked up. A woman stood at the edge of his table, holding a notebook and a battered leather satchel. She was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, with auburn hair tied into a messy ponytail and a face that bore traces of sleepless nights. Her gray-green eyes were alert but not intrusive, and her clothes, dark jeans, brown jacket, worn boots, gave her the look of someone who traveled light and trusted no one. "Yes?" Ethan said carefully. She smiled faintly and extended a hand. "Nora Fields, independent journalist. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday." Ethan didn't shake her hand. "About what?" "The Hopewell Foundation," she replied, pulling up a chair uninvited. "And the organization that funds it, Golden Cross Group." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Never heard of them." Nora leaned forward, lowering her voice. "They own several medical facilities across the country, rehab centers, veteran care homes, hospice clinics. On paper, they look like saints. But follow the money, and you'll find the same pattern: elderly veterans admitted for minor conditions suddenly deteriorate. Their assets are transferred into trust accounts managed by subsidiaries. The families get excuses. The records vanish." Her words hit like slow detonations. "Why come to me?" Ethan asked. "Because your father fits the pattern," she said. "I've been following Golden Cross for 2 years. Last night, I got a tip that someone under their network was transferred here under a different name." She opened her notebook, flipping through scribbled pages. "One of their nurses, Lena Moore." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What do you know about her?" Nora hesitated, then passed him a small photo clipped from a personnel report. It showed Lena smiling under bright office lighting, but there was something vacant in her expression. "She used to work for Hopewell," Nora said. "They shut down after a class action lawsuit for patient exploitation, but she resurfaced under a new name 3 months ago." Ethan looked at the picture, then back at the journalist. "How did you even get this?" Nora smirked faintly. "I don't play by hospital rules." For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the cafe fading around them. Then Ethan said, "If what you're saying is true, they're not just scamming families, they're murdering veterans." Nora's gaze hardened. "Exactly." Rex lifted his head, sniffing the air, then rested his chin again. The dog's calmness contrasted the storm forming in Ethan's mind. He leaned closer. "I need proof." "You'll have it," she said, "but you'll have to move fast. Golden Cross buries its tracks deep. I've already had 2 sources disappear. And one of them was a nurse from this hospital." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Disappeared how?" "They called it suicide," Nora replied quietly. "But I read the coroner's report. Her wrists were broken before she died." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The smell of disinfectant seemed suddenly sharper. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone. "I need access to the hospital's security feed from last night. If Lena did anything to the IV, it's there." "That won't be easy," Nora warned. "They encrypt their cameras, especially patient wards." Ethan's lips curved in a faint, humorless smile. "Good thing I'm not new to infiltration." For the first time, Nora's expression softened. "You really are your father's son." He didn't answer. His mind was already moving, assembling steps, patterns, threats. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to room 214. The snow had stopped, leaving the window glass streaked with water. His father's breathing was steady, his face unchanged. But the IV bag, the one from last night, was gone, replaced with a new one. No one had told him. He pressed the call button. After a few moments, a nurse entered, short and round-faced, her expression harried. "Can I help you, sir?" "What happened to the IV bag that was here last night?" Ethan asked. She frowned. "It was disposed of this morning. Standard rotation. Who ordered it?" She glanced at the chart. "Dr. Collins, I believe." Ethan's heart eased slightly, but only slightly. "Thanks," he said. When she left, he looked down at Rex, who had risen silently beside him. "We're being watched," he murmured. The dog's ears flicked toward the hallway, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. That night, as the lights dimmed and the hospital fell quiet, Ethan sat by his father's side once more. He thought of the line his father had once told him after a mission gone wrong. "The enemy doesn't always wear a uniform, son. Sometimes he carries a clipboard." Now those words felt less like wisdom and more like prophecy. The shadows in Street, Helena Hospital were growing darker, and Ethan knew the war he'd tried to leave behind had found him again, only this time the battlefield wore white coats and smiled. The snow had returned that night, thicker and heavier than before, blanketing the roof of Street Helena Hospital in a dense silence that swallowed even the sound of the wind. It was the kind of snow that seemed to erase the world soft, pure, and mercilessly quiet. Inside the dim corridors, only the low hum of the heating vents and the occasional flicker of an overhead light reminded the living that they were not alone among the sleeping. Ethan Ward sat by his father's bedside, exhaustion gnawing at the edges of his mind. The steady pulse of the heart monitor had become hypnotic, a cruel lullaby. On the chair beside him lay the file Nora Fields had given earlier that day, pages filled with printed names and photos, veterans who had died under the same circumstances, each one labeled cardiac failure. The coincidences were too clean, too convenient, the kind of perfection only crime could design. Rex, lying at the foot of the bed, stirred restlessly. His brown eyes, sharp and reflective, glowed faintly in the dim light. The dog's instincts were always tuned tighter at night. Ethan trusted those instincts more than he trusted the sterile safety of the hospital walls. At 1:17 a.m., the corridor light outside flickered once, twice, then went dark. Ethan's eyes snapped open. Rex's ears perked immediately, followed by a deep, rumbling growl. The soldier in Ethan was fully awake before his mind had even caught up. He rose silently, his boots making no sound against the tile. He reached for the bedside lamp, switched it off, and stood in the shadows. Through the thin crack beneath the door, a faint glow appeared, the weak reflection of light off metal. Someone was there. The door handle turned slowly. It was Lena Moore. She stepped into the room, moving with practiced quiet. Her uniform was different tonight, darker scrubs beneath a gray overcoat that seemed out of place indoors. Her blonde hair, usually tied neatly, now fell loose around her face, damp from the falling snow outside. The dim light from the hallway caught the sheen of her silver earrings and the glint of something else, the polished tray she carried in one hand. On it rested a small syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid. She paused near the bed, glancing briefly at Arthur Ward's monitors. Her expression was calm, mechanical even, as if she were performing a routine task. But Ethan could see it now, the faint tremor at the edge of her fingers, the darting movement of her eyes. Whatever this was, it wasn't medical. Rex's low growl broke the silence. Lena froze. Her head snapped toward the dark corner of the room. "Shh," she whispered, though to whom, Ethan couldn't tell the dog or herself. When she took another step toward the IV line, Rex lunged forward, barking sharply, the sound exploding through the quiet like gunfire. Lena gasped, stumbling back. The tray clattered to the floor, the syringe rolling toward the door. Ethan moved instantly. "Stop!" His voice cut through the room like a command from the battlefield. Lena turned toward him, eyes wide, face pale. For a moment she looked like prey caught in the glare of headlights. "Lieutenant, it's not what it looks like." But Ethan had already crossed the room. Drop whatever you have left." She hesitated, her breath shallow, trembling between fear and calculation. Then, suddenly, she bolted. Ethan lunged after her, his hand grazing her sleeve, but she slipped free, darting out the door and into the dark hallway. Her shoes slapped against the linoleum floor, echoing through the silent wing. Ethan sprinted after her, Rex at his side, claws scraping as they turned the corner. The corridor lights flickered again, plunging everything into near darkness. Somewhere ahead, a door slammed. Ethan reached the stairwell just in time to hear the emergency exit alarm blip once, then silence. Someone had disabled it. He burst through the stair door, scanning downward. Faint footprints of melting snow trailed across the landing, leading to the basement level. He descended cautiously, hand instinctively reaching for the holster that wasn't there. Years of combat training turned into pure reflex. His breathing slowed, every sense sharpened. Rex moved ahead, nose low, tail stiff. The basement lights flickered weakly, revealing rows of old storage lockers and unused equipment, the kind of forgotten space hospitals accumulate like secrets. Then, movement, a shadow ducking around the corner at the far end. "Lena!" Ethan's voice echoed off the walls. "Stop running! You're making this worse!" No answer. Only the hum of the old generators. When he reached the corner, she was gone. The back door, slightly ajar, swayed in the cold air. Snow was blowing in through the crack, coating the floor in thin white dust. He stepped outside. The parking lot beyond was nearly invisible under the heavy snowstorm. Tire marks led out toward the service road, but no headlights, no engine. She was gone. Rex whined beside him, nose pressing into the snow near the doorway. Ethan followed his gaze there. Half buried in the drift was the fallen syringe. The needle glinted under the security light, like a shard of ice. Carefully, he picked it up by the barrel, using a tissue from his pocket, wrapping it tight. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the light, colorless, thick, deadly. He didn't need a lab to know it was poison. By the time Ethan returned to the room, his pulse had steadied, but the anger beneath it had not. He set the syringe on the tray beside his father's bed and sat down again. Rex circled once before lying down, still restless. Ethan stared at his father's still face. "You were right," he murmured quietly. "They hide behind charity." He thought of Nora, of what she'd said about Golden Cross, how they had infiltrated the system through foundations, grants, and hospital partnerships. It all fit too perfectly now. Lena wasn't a nurse by accident. She was placed here. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 a.m. Ethan's phone vibrated softly, a message from Nora. Found more files. Hopewell had military connections. Call me when safe. He typed back a single line. She tried to kill him tonight. A pause. Then her reply appeared. Then we're running out of time. Ethan set the phone down, leaning back in the chair, mind spinning with possibilities. He should call security, but he knew what would happen. Lena would vanish before the report even processed. He needed proof, not panic. Rex lifted his head suddenly, nose twitching. He padded toward the hallway door, ears raised. Ethan stood. "What is it, boy?" The dog's gaze locked on the door window. For a split second, Ethan thought he saw movement beyond a faint silhouette, too still to be a passerby. He stepped closer, but when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. Only the hum of the heater and the faint echo of wind from the stairwell. He closed the door slowly, exhaling. The syringe lay on the tray, its silver barrel reflecting the dim light like a mirror. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed in the distance, maybe police, maybe ambulance. But to Ethan, It sounded like something else entirely. A call to arms. The war had followed him home, and it wore a nurse's smile. Morning broke gray and cold over Helena Ridge, the kind of pale dawn that made everything look colorless and tired. The storm had passed, but the air was heavy with a silence that felt suspiciously deliberate, as if the world were holding its breath. From the window of room 214, Ethan Ward watched nurses in white coats move across the parking lot like ghosts drifting through fog. Their calm rhythm should have been reassuring, but after the night before, every sound, every glance, seemed like camouflage for something darker. When he turned back to the room, he noticed the screen on his father's monitor flashing an unfamiliar code. The usual heart rate graph was gone, replaced by an error message. He pressed the call button. Nothing. The intercom was dead. Then he checked the folder where Dr. Henry Collins had left the lab results. Gone. His father's medical chart gone too. The clipboard hanging by the bed empty. He moved quickly to the nurse's station. The main terminal blinked with the hospital's blue login screen. He typed his father's patient ID, then paused when the system replied, "No record found." A cold pulse traveled down his spine. He tried again. Same result. He switched to manual search. Nothing. It was as if Arthur Ward had never existed in the hospital's records. Ethan's hands curled into fists. They wiped him. Behind the counter, a young clerk looked up, startled. "Sir?" Ethan leaned in, voice tight. "Arthur Ward. Room 214. Where's his file?" The clerk, a man in his 20s, with acne scars and dark-rimmed glasses, shifted nervously. "If it's not in the system, maybe the data's syncing. The servers reboot after maintenance. Maintenance doesn't delete an entire patient." Before the clerk could respond, Rex let out a low growl. His ears perked toward the hallway. Ethan followed his gaze and saw two men in dark suits speaking to a nurse at the far end. They weren't hospital staff. Their movements were too deliberate, their posture military. One of them caught Ethan's eye briefly before turning away. He felt that old combat alertness stir in his gut, the sixth sense that never failed him in Afghanistan. Something was moving behind the scenes. He returned to the room, shut the door, and dialed Nora Fields. She answered on the third ring. "You're calling early," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "They erased my father's records," Ethan said. "All of them. Even the physical files are gone." There was a pause. "That means you scared them last night. They're closing ranks." Ethan exhaled sharply. "I found the syringe she dropped. Whatever's in it isn't standard medication. We need to get it tested." "I can help with that," Nora said. "But there's something else. I dug deeper after your text. The nurse Lena Moore used to work for a field operative named Victor Crane. Name ring a bell?" Ethan froze. "Crane. Yeah. My father served with him in the Gulf. Intelligence Division. He was court-martialed for embezzling veteran aid funds." "Well, he's resurfaced," Nora said grimly. "And guess what company he sits on the board for? Golden Cross." "Exactly. He's their regional director for medical acquisitions. Every hospital tied to them funnels veteran patients through a network of private trusts. Guess where those trusts end up?" Ethan's voice turned cold. "In Crane's pocket. Bingo." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The anger in his chest was steady, measured. He looked at his father still breathing, still fighting, and felt that old soldier's clarity return. "Send me everything you have," he said finally. "I'll meet you in person," Nora replied. "Safer than email. There's a diner 2 blocks from the hospital, Harper's. 10 minutes? I'll be there." He hung up, pulled on his jacket, and gave Rex a quiet command. Stay. The dog whined softly but obeyed, curling beside Arthur's bed. The diner was half empty when he arrived, the smell of burnt coffee clinging to the air. Nora Fields was already there, hunched over a laptop in a corner booth. She looked different in daylight, sharper somehow, her auburn hair catching the pale sun through the frosted window. Her eyes carried that restless energy of someone who'd learned to live on caffeine and paranoia. "Morning," Ethan said, sliding into the booth. She pushed a flash drive across the table. "Here. Everything I could trace overnight. 12 veterans, all dead within 3 months of admission to Golden Cross-affiliated hospitals. Same MO toxins disguised as sedatives, followed by false death certificates. Families never saw the bodies. All assets transferred to shell companies within 72 hours. Ethan opened the laptop. The names scrolled across the screen like a roll call of ghosts. One photo stopped him. Cold. Thomas Beckett, a former Marine sergeant who had served with Arthur in 1989. "My father knew him," Ethan murmured. "Then your father's name being on that list isn't random," Nora said. "He's the last one alive." Ethan leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "So, Crane's cleaning up the past." Nora nodded. "And your father's the last loose end." Their conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of the diner door. A tall man entered, shaking snow off his coat. His presence shifted the air, immediately rigid posture, assessing eyes, a certain weight that only comes from years of command. He was in his mid-50s, his black hair streaked with silver, his face clean-shaven, but lined with the wear of hard decisions. His suit was expensive but not new, and the faint scar across his temple suggested an old battlefield injury. Ethan recognized him before the man even spoke. Victor Crane. "Lieutenant Ward," Crane greeted, voice calm, low, almost courteous. "You've grown into your father's shadow." Ethan didn't stand. "You shouldn't be here." "I could say the same," Crane said, sliding into the opposite booth without invitation. "You're causing quite a stir at Street Helena." Nora tensed beside him. "How did you—" Crane's gaze flicked to her briefly. "Miss Fields, isn't it? You've been meddling in business you don't understand. Investigative journalism can be a dangerous hobby." Her jaw tightened. "So can murder," Crane smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy? Golden Cross is philanthropy, Miss Fields. We take care of those who built this country." Ethan leaned forward. "By killing them?" Crane's eyes darkened, but his tone remained measured. "By giving them peace. Men like your father broken, forgotten they suffer. We simply ease the transition." Ethan's hand clenched on the table. "You call that mercy? I call it efficiency," Crane said softly. "You of all people should understand that, Lieutenant. You were trained to eliminate threats swiftly. We do the same, just under brighter lights." Nora's voice cut through the tension. "You're insane." Crane ignored her, turning his gaze back to Ethan. "Go home, son. Take your dog and leave Helena Ridge. Your father's death will be clean, painless, and respectable. You can even sign the release yourself." Ethan rose slowly. "If you touch him, I'll make sure the world knows what you've done." Crane stood as well, adjusting his coat. "You think the world cares about old soldiers? The world moves on, and soon, so will you." Then he left, his footsteps soft against the tile, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and rot. Nora exhaled shakily. "He's not bluffing." Ethan looked out the window, where Crane's black sedan disappeared into the fog. "No," he said quietly, "he never does." He sat again, staring at the list of names on Nora's laptop. "He's finishing what he started 30 years ago," he murmured. "Then we have to stop him," Nora said. Ethan nodded. We will. But first, I need to move my father. Move him where? Somewhere Golden Cross can't reach. Nora looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. You have somewhere in mind? Ethan's expression hardened. Yeah. A place even ghosts don't follow. Outside, the snow began to fall again, thick and silent, a curtain of white descending between truth and death. And as Ethan watched it cover the streets, he realized the war had come home in a different uniform this time. The enemy didn't carry rifles, but records, syringes, and signatures. The snow outside had hardened into glass by nightfall, reflecting the dull orange glow of the streetlights against the hospital windows. Inside Street, Helena Hospital. The halls were unnaturally quiet, too quiet for a place that claimed to heal. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed like anxious nerves, and every distant sound seemed sharper, amplified by the kind of tension that comes when danger breathes just out of sight. Ethan Ward stood by the door of room 214, checking the placement of the small wireless camera hidden behind the corner vent. It was barely larger than a coin, its lens disguised under a smudge of dust. Across the room, Dr. Henry Collins adjusted another device, a micro-recorder taped beneath the metal frame of the bed. Henry's hands trembled slightly, his face drawn and pale under the sterile lighting. The man had been a soldier in his own quiet war for years, one fought against red tape and hospital politics. But tonight was different. This was no moral battle. It was survival. Everything's live, Henry said, his voice low. Feeds are transmitting directly to the secondary server I set up in radiology. If they access the hospital network, they won't see a thing. Ethan nodded. You're sure no one else knows? Not unless someone's reading my mind. Henry gave a weary smile that didn't reach his eyes. The dark circles under them spoke of sleepless nights and lingering guilt, the kind that only comes from realizing how many things you've ignored too long. Rex sat near the bed, head raised, amber eyes alert. The German shepherd had sensed the tension the moment Ethan started moving differently. He was no longer in the rhythm of a son, he had become a soldier again, and Rex, his silent partner, fell right back into formation. They waited. At 1:03 a.m., the hallway lights flickered once, then steadied. Ethan's hand tightened around the tranquilizer pistol in his coat. He wasn't here to kill anyone. He just needed proof. Proof that would end this. Henry checked his watch. They'll come soon, he whispered. You sure about this? Ethan's gray eyes met his. You asked me earlier if I've ever set a trap before, he said. Let's just say I used to do it for a living. They fell silent. The hum of machines filled the room again, the rhythmic beep of Arthur Ward's monitor, steady and calm, the only heartbeat in the storm about to break. Then, a sound. Soft footsteps. 2 sets. The door handle turned slowly. Ethan took a step back into the corner, blending into the shadow near the cabinet. Henry stood by the bed, pretending to adjust the IV line. The door opened. Lena Moore entered first, her scrubs hidden beneath a dark hospital coat, face half covered by a surgical mask. Her once carefully tied hair now hung in disarray, and her eyes darted nervously toward the monitors. She carried a silver medical case. Behind her came Victor Crane, his presence as heavy as the silence he brought. Crane had shed his expensive suit for something practical, a black tactical jacket, gloves, and an expression as still as carved stone. In the dim light, the scar on his temple looked like a streak of ice. His eyes, steel gray and devoid of warmth, scanned the room with a precision Ethan recognized instantly. Military eyes. Calculating. Cold. Let's make this quick, Crane muttered. He's been on the ventilator long enough. The old man's heart will give us the alibi we need." Lena hesitated, her gloved hands trembling as she opened the case. Inside lay 2 syringes, one filled with a clear liquid, the other with something faintly blue. "Are you sure we have to do this ourselves?" she whispered. "They'll trace it." "They won't trace anything," Crane interrupted. "Henry's already signed the authorization form." Henry flinched inwardly but kept his expression blank. Ethan felt a surge of respect for the doctor's courage standing in plain sight of a monster who thought he'd already bought him. Lena moved toward Arthur's bed, the syringe trembling in her hand. Rex shifted, muscles taut, growl rumbling like thunder building in the distance. Crane caught the sound, his head turning sharply. "You brought the dog here?" Henry forced a nervous laugh. "Security dog, standard overnight protocol. Get rid of it," Crane ordered. But before anyone could move, Ethan stepped from the shadows. "You first." The shock that flickered across Crane's face was brief but real. "Lieutenant Ward," he said evenly, "I warned you not to interfere." "You warned me to run," Ethan said, raising the tranquilizer pistol. "That's not in my training." Crane's jaw tightened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," Ethan replied, "I do. You're a traitor who used the system you swore to serve." Rex barked once sharp, commanding, and the room exploded into chaos. Crane drew a weapon from his jacket. Not a gun, but a syringe filled with the same blue liquid. He lunged toward the bed, aiming for Arthur's foreline. Ethan fired. The dart struck Crane's arm, but he barely flinched, adrenaline and fury overriding the sedative. He swung the syringe like a blade. Henry dove to the side, knocking over a tray of instruments. Metal clattered across the floor. Rex lunged, his jaws clamping onto Crane's forearm, the sound of teeth meeting fabric and flesh sharp in the air. Crane roared, slamming his arm against the bed rail, but Rex didn't let go. Meanwhile, Lena dropped the silver case, her mask falling away. She tried to run, but Ethan caught her by the wrist. "Not this time," he growled. "I didn't want to," she began, voice breaking. "Save it," he snapped, pushing her against the wall. "Who gave the order?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Crane," she whispered. "Always. Crane. He said no one would ever know. He said we were helping them." "Helping?" Ethan spat. "By killing them?" She shook her head desperately. "They were all dying anyway." "That's what he told us. He said they'd consented, that it was mercy." Before she could finish, a shout echoed from the hallway. "Police! Hands up!" The door burst open. 2 officers in tactical vests stormed in, guns drawn. Behind them, a 3rd officer tall, with dark skin and a steady, commanding presence, barked orders. "Step away from the patient." Ethan lowered his weapon slowly. "He's the one you want," he said, nodding toward Crane. Crane, pinned under Rex's weight, glared up with venom. "You think you've won, Ward? You think this ends with me?" Ethan's voice was steady. "No. It ends with the truth." The officers dragged Crane to his feet, cuffing him. Lena collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. One of the officers read her rights, while Henry stood frozen near the bed, his chest rising and falling with silent relief. As they led Crane away, he turned his head slightly, smirking through bloodied lips. "You can't stop what's already built, Lieutenant. Golden Cross doesn't die. It expands." Ethan said nothing. He simply watched as they took him away, Rex still growling low, unwilling to relax, even in victory. The room fell silent again. The only sound left was the rhythmic beep of Arthur's monitor, steady, alive. Henry leaned against the wall, his hands shaking. "If you hadn't been here," Ethan looked at him. "You were here. That's what matters." He picked up the fallen silver case, now empty, except for a single syringe that had rolled beneath the bed. He stared at it for a long moment before placing it inside an evidence bag. "This ends in court," he said quietly. Henry nodded, his voice trembling. And what if Crane was right? What if Golden Cross goes deeper than him? Ethan glanced down at Rex, who sat beside him, eyes still fixed on the door where Crane had been taken. Then we dig deeper. Outside, dawn began to break, a pale light filtering through the blinds, cutting across the sterile walls. It didn't feel like peace. It felt like a ceasefire, fragile, temporary. But for now, Arthur Ward was alive, and that was enough. Snow fell like powdered glass over Denver, drifting in slow spirals beneath the courthouse lights. It was the kind of cold that bit through wool and bone alike, the kind that made silence feel heavier. Outside the courthouse steps, a crowd had gathered, reporters, veterans, civilians, all bundled in coats, faces red from the frost, their breaths mingling in the frozen air like smoke from a battlefield. Cameras flashed in bursts of white, and the murmurs of anticipation rippled like wind through dry grass. Inside, Ethan Ward sat stiffly in the second row of the courtroom, his dress uniform freshly pressed, his medals glinting faintly beneath the overhead lights. He had shaved, but the exhaustion in his eyes could not be polished away. Weeks of interviews, statements, and depositions had etched new lines into his face lines that told of a man who'd been forced to fight a different kind of war, one waged in silence and shadows. Beside him sat Dr. Henry Collins, wearing a simple, gray suit. The man looked smaller than he had in the hospital, as if the truth had taken something from him. But there was also a quiet strength in the way he held his posture, a dignity born from redemption. And at Ethan's feet, calm but watchful, lay Rex, his thick sable coat brushed and gleaming. His golden eyes flicked toward every sound, every shift in the air, as though he still expected danger to come from behind. The courtroom was foreign to him, but the soldier's instinct in his blood never rested. When the door opened at the front of the chamber, all eyes turned. Victor Crane entered in shackles, flanked by two federal marshals. He was no longer the polished strategist in tailored suits. His gray prison uniform hung loosely over a frame that had lost its confidence, but not its pride. His once carefully combed hair now streaked unevenly with white, and the scar on his temple stood out sharply, almost glowing under the courtroom lights. Still, his gaze was the same icy, deliberate, unyielding. He glanced toward Ethan, and for a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes. There was no hatred left between them, only the faint echo of recognition, the understanding between two soldiers who had chosen different gods to serve. The judge, Margaret Delaney, took her seat. She was in her late 50s, a stern woman with short silver hair and piercing hazel eyes. Her presence commanded respect without needing to raise her voice. Years in the federal bench had carved authority into her every gesture. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. Court is now in session for sentencing in the matter of United States versus Victor Crane and Lena Moore, she announced. Her tone was measured, almost ritualistic. Both defendants have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and large-scale financial fraud under the operation known as Golden Cross Group. She paused, looking toward Crane. "Mr. Crane, do you wish to speak before sentencing?" Crane stood slowly, his cuffs clinking softly. "I have nothing to apologize for," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "The men we relieved were already dying. Forgotten. I gave them peace when the world gave them neglect." He turned his gaze toward Ethan again. "Tell me, Lieutenant, How many did you send to die in foreign deserts? And you call me a murderer?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. He simply stared back, letting the silence crush Crane's words beneath its weight. Judge Delaney's gavel struck once. "Enough." Her voice was ice. "What you did was not mercy. It was greed disguised as compassion, and the law does not confuse the two." Crane's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The judge turned to Lena Moore, seated beside her lawyer. Lena looked fragile, almost translucent. Her blonde hair was dull, her face pale, her eyes hollow from months of confinement. She clutched a tissue in both hands, trembling. "Miss Moore," Judge Delaney said, "your cooperation in this case spared further loss of life. The court recognizes that. You will serve 15 years in a federal facility, with parole eligibility after 10. Lena burst into tears, nodding mutely. Then the judge faced Crane again. "Victor Crane, for your crimes against veterans of this nation, men and women who gave their lives and health in service, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The sound of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. Crane's face remained expressionless. But when the marshals led him away, he turned his head toward Ethan one last time. "You've won the battle," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "But the system, your precious system, is built by men like me, and it will bury you too." Ethan watched him go, the heavy door closing behind him with a metallic thud that sounded almost like closure, but not quite. Afterward, the courthouse steps were chaos. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust like bayonets toward every witness. Nora Fields stood at the center of it all, her breath visible in the frigid air as she addressed the camera crew from Channel 7 News. She wore a long navy trench coat, her auburn hair gleaming against the white snow, and her eyes carried the fierce focus of someone who had lived the story she reported. "In a historic verdict," she said into the mic, "the court today delivered justice for over 20 veterans whose lives were stolen by the Golden Cross Network. Central to the case evidence captured on hidden camera and the testimony of a Navy SEAL who refused to stay silent." Her gaze flicked briefly to Ethan, who stood a few feet away. Rex sat beside him, calm and steady, as snowflakes gathered on his fur. The cameras turned toward them, flashes lighting the air. Nora continued, her voice softening slightly. "The case also brought to light an unlikely hero, a 5-year-old German shepherd named Rex, whose instincts and loyalty exposed the conspiracy that might have claimed another life. As the nation watches, one truth remains. Sometimes, justice has 4 legs and a bark that cannot be silenced." Rex tilted his head, as if understanding his name. Then, as one cameraman crouched low, he barked once sharp, resonant, echoing through the street. The crowd laughed and applauded, and for a brief, shining moment, the weight of grief and corruption gave way to something lighter, something clean. Later that evening, the story spread across every screen in America. The headline read, "The Dog Who Barked for Honor." Nora's article painted a vivid portrait of courage and loyalty, the bond between man and dog that had toppled a machine built on greed. Veterans across the country shared the story, tagging it with photos of their own service dogs. News anchors debated what reforms might come next. Politicians gave speeches, and strangers mailed treats and collars to the local police department, asking for them to be for Rex. Ethan tried to stay out of the spotlight. He didn't attend the interviews, didn't pose for cameras. For him, the true victory wasn't the verdict. It was the steady rhythm of his father's breathing back in Street Helena Hospital. Arthur Ward had opened his eyes 3 days before the trial, his voice weak but steady. "I heard about the dog." he had murmured, with a faint smile. Guess he takes after you, always barking at the right people. Ethan had laughed then, the sound strange in his own throat. Yeah, he said softly. He does. Now, standing in the twilight outside the courthouse, he looked down at Rex. The dog's breath rose in small clouds, his ears twitching at every passing siren. Ethan crouched beside him, brushing the snow from his fur. You did good, partner, he whispered. Rex pressed his head against Ethan's knee, tail wagging once. Above them, the courthouse lights flickered against the falling snow, soft, gold, almost holy. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, justice had a heartbeat. Morning arrived gently over Street Helena, soft as a prayer whispered through cold air. The last of the winter snow had begun to melt, dripping from the hospital roof in tiny rivulets that caught the sunlight like threads of glass. The sky, once a bruised gray through months of storm, was now the color of forgiveness, pale blue, streaked with gold. The world, for once, seemed still. Inside room 214, the beeping of machines had faded into something calmer, slower. The scent of antiseptic still lingered, but it mingled now with the faint aroma of morning coffee and fresh linens. Ethan Ward sat beside his father's bed, his uniform jacket draped over the chair, his sleeves rolled up. His hands, calloused from years of holding weapons, now held a mug of coffee, trembling slightly not from fear, but from a fragile, unexpected hope. His father, Arthur Ward, was awake. The old man's eyes, once clouded and distant, were clear, now blue-gray like his son's, but softer, tempered by age and time. His skin was pale, the kind that carried the story of both battlefields and hospital rooms, but there was warmth in his gaze again. His fingers, though weak, found Ethan's hand with surprising strength. "Morning, soldier," Arthur whispered, his voice raspy but alive. Ethan looked up from his chair, eyes widening with a mix of disbelief and relief. "You had me thinking you'd gone AWOL," he said, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Arthur gave a low, tired chuckle that ended in a cough. "Not yet. The old engine still runs." The words hung between them, heavy with emotion neither man could quite name. For so long, they had both lived in silence, one carrying the ghosts of war, the other trying to outfight them. Now, in this small hospital room, surrounded by melting snow and the hum of machines, peace finally felt possible. Arthur turned his head slowly, eyes finding the window where sunlight spilled through thin curtains. "You remember what I told you before I fell ill?" Ethan nodded faintly. "You said not to trust people who hide greed behind charity." Arthur's mouth curved into a slow, bittersweet smile. "I said more than that. I said, not every soldier carries a gun. Sometimes, son, an act of courage isn't pulling the trigger, it's standing up when everyone else bows their head." The words settled deep into Ethan's chest, warm and sharp all at once. He had faced enemies on sand dunes, in alleyways, and in silent hospital corridors. But none of it had felt as sacred as this, hearing his father speak again, feeling the weight of his approval. Arthur's gaze softened. "You did right, Ethan. You made me proud." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to speak. He simply nodded, the motion small but full of meaning. Outside, Rex barked once short, alert, as if sensing the shift in the air. Ethan turned toward the sound. Through the window, he saw the German shepherd standing near the hospital's small garden courtyard, tail wagging, paws leaving prints on the damp stone path. His fur gleamed under the morning light, a halo of gold against the last patches of snow. Ethan smiled faintly. "He hasn't left your side since the day we brought you in." Arthur's lips quirked upward. Smart dog. Knows where the fight is. A nurse entered quietly, Mira Sanchez, a woman in her mid-30s with warm brown skin and soft black curls tucked under her cap. She had kind eyes, the kind that made even a sterile hospital room feel like home. "Mr. Ward," she said gently, "your vitals are holding strong. I think you might even be ready for a little sunshine today." Arthur looked at Ethan, that familiar stubborn spark flickering in his eyes. "What do you say, Lieutenant? You think you can handle an old man and a leash?" Ethan chuckled. "I've handled worse." 10 minutes later, the three of them, father, son, and dog, stepped into the garden, behind Street Helena. The snow had melted in patches, revealing damp earth and shy hints of green beneath. The winter air still held a bite, but sunlight poured over the courtyard like a blessing. Arthur leaned on Ethan's arm as they walked, his gait slow but steady. Each step was deliberate, like a man reclaiming something stolen. Rex trotted ahead, occasionally turning back with an impatient bark, as if urging them to keep up. At the far end of the courtyard stood a small iron bench beneath a bare maple tree. From there, they could see the Street Helena Chapel, its stone bell tower rising like a sentinel above the hospital roofs. The church bells began to ring soft at first, then swelling into a full, echoing harmony that rolled through the air like waves. Arthur stopped walking, tilting his head toward the sound. "That bell's been ringing since before you were born," he said quietly. "I used to hear it when I worked night shifts at the docks. Funny how it sounds. Different now." Ethan looked at him. "How's that?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Back then, it sounded like duty. Now it sounds like peace." Rex barked again, not sharply, not in warning, but in a joyous burst that filled the courtyard. He ran in circles around them, tail whipping through the air, paws kicking up droplets of melting snow. The sound echoed off the walls, bright and full, like laughter turned into sound. Arthur sank onto the bench, catching his breath. Ethan sat beside him, resting his elbows on his knees. The sun broke fully through the clouds, spilling light across their faces. For a while, no one spoke. The bells faded into silence, leaving only the soft rhythm of wind and the steady panting of the dog. Arthur broke the quiet first. "You know, I used to believe that the world was made of men who fought and men who watched, but I was wrong. It's made of those who remember and those who don't." Ethan turned toward him. "And which one are we?" Arthur smiled, eyes half closed against the light. "We're the ones who remember. That's why it matters." He reached out, placing a frail hand on his son's shoulder. "Promise me something, Ethan. When I'm gone, don't let the world forget men like them, the ones who fought, the ones who fell, even the ones who barked." Ethan nodded slowly. "I promise." Rex trotted over then, resting his head on Arthur's knee. The old man's wrinkled hand found the dog's fur and patted gently. "You too, soldier," he said softly. "You keep him in line." The sunlight flared, then golden, blinding, alive, spilling across the courtyard, across three figures frozen in that quiet moment of triumph and peace. The father who had fought his wars, the son who had inherited his courage, and the dog who had carried their faith when both men had faltered. As the bells of Street Helena tolled their last note, Rex barked once more, not in warning, but in joy. The sound rose into the air and scattered through the cold light, blending with the song of melting snow, and for that brief, eternal instant, winter finally ended. In the end, the story of Ethan, Arthur, and Rex reminds us that miracles are not always loud or grand. They often arrive quietly through courage, love, and faith. Sometimes, God sends his angels not with wings, but with paws and loyal hearts to guide us through the darkness. In our everyday lives, we too face battles that test our strength and faith. When we stand for what's right, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and choose compassion over fear, we become part of that divine miracle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in hope. Leave a comment to honor the heroes in your life, and subscribe to our channel to keep faith alive through stories of courage and redemption. May God bless you and keep you in His light, always.